Good morning, guys. Today we're going to be looking at the next step of arrays, one-dimensional arrays. We haven't gotten into any larger dimension arrays yet, but a very important concept in Java of how to use arrays. Now, the usage of arrays that we have seen so far have been pretty basic. The only arrays that we have created have held the primitive data types. I'm going to say that again. The only arrays that we have looked at so far have only held the primitive data types. We have we have constructed arrays, one-dimensional arrays that holds doubles, holds strings, which really isn't primitive, but we can treat them as primitive, and holds integers. And then we went in and we manipulated those arrays. We added the elements, or we sorted them, or we found averages, etc. But what we're going to be doing here today, and it's a very important concept in Java, is creating arrays of objects, not of primitive data types. Now, from those arrays that we did look at that held the primitive data types, we also went in and created an object in our runner class to go and manipulate that. But what we're going to be doing here today is actually creating an array of objects, not of your primitive data types. So please be careful, understand the difference between the two. All right, so we can create an arrays of objects that are instances of classes that you have written. So if you already have a class that is written, we can create an object or an array of objects for that class. Now it's going to be very, very similar to what we have done, but there's one small little thing that you have to really pay close attention to, and I'll alert you to it when we get there. All right, back in chapter 6, we looked at a class that we had called bank account. And if you recall from that bank account class, we had methods in it that held the balance. The constructor accepted the balance and stuff and initiated the array in the class. And we also had methods that would be a deposit, increase the amount in the account. We had a method that would do a withdrawal, take money out of the account. We had our setter and our getter methods that would simply just set the balance in the account or go and get the balance in the account. Very basic class that we looked at. And if you can't remember that, you might want to pause and take a couple of minutes and go back and review that bank account class that we created. But what we're going to be doing here today is we're going to use that bank account class to build an array with it. So let's look at this statement right here. So as strings are objects, we can build an array that contains strings. We can build an array that contains other class objects as well. So here, instead of saying int or double or string, which is what we have just recently used, we are going to create a one-dimensional array called bank account. Bank account is just another data type from a class that we have built. So this array will be a bank account array. It will have the variable name called accounts. We construct it just like we normally do whenever that's an int or a double. And we say new bank account. And again, this is our size declarator. So this should all look very similar to you. Nothing has changed here other than this is not a primitive data type. This is now already a class type or an object because we're creating an array of objects. Now be very, very careful here. Here's the part that is different. Whenever you create an array of objects and you say equals new, if we were creating integers or doubles or strings, when we say equals new, we were creating the array. Well, that is still true here. And we could initialize our array with individual values at the time we create it, or we could fill it later. Now, when we create an array of objects, this array is being constructed right here, but there's nothing in it. The elements in there are null. They're not zeros because, again, this isn't primitive, this isn't an integer, this isn't a string. So what would you put in there? And that's because these aren't primitive data types. So when you create this array of objects, this array has been created, but the objects themselves have not yet been created. This size declarator here of 5, where did my cursor go? Of 5 tells us that we are going to create 5 bank account objects, But this statement does not yet create those 5 bank accounts. It's only creating the array that will build the 5 bank account objects and hold them. Okay, so it creates the array, but it does not yet create the objects. We will have to create the objects later in a loop. So when we write this statement here, this is what's really happening. We have created 5 bank accounts called accounts, and right now these accounts are null. They have not yet been built. They're not holding anything. They don't yet exist because we have not yet created them. Okay, we only, by using the new keyword here, we only created the array of bank accounts, but we have not yet created the bank account objects themselves. Okay, so if you need to rewind and listen to that a couple of times so that you can understand the difference, please do so. If not, we're ready to move on. All right, once we create that bank account array, we now have to create the bank account objects that we said that we were going to based upon our size declarator. And in our example, that was 5. Now we're going to look at a program here in a moment called object array. But and you're going to see, once we look at that program, what has actually happened here, we're going to use a loop now to actually create the objects. So we say for int I equals 0, because we have to start at the beginning of the array. And we will continue this as long as I is less than accounts.length. And again, that'll be the length of the array. But here's the part that will actually create the new bank accounts that are in the array. So we say accounts sub I, and again, we're starting at our loop at 0, equals new bank account. We have to use the new keyword again because we're now actually creating the object. And we're creating the new bank account. Now, inside this loop, when we do this, we now have the actual accounts that have been created. And at that time, now the balances have been set to 0, because within that bank account class, if you go back and look at it, the constructor constructs and it initializes the private instance variables with the balance of whatever is coming in. So now the balances in the account are 0. When we first created the array of bank accounts, the accounts have not yet been created, so that's why they were null. But now in the loop, when we actually created the new accounts that are in the array, once those are constructed, now the balances hold values of 0. So I hope that you understand the difference there between the two. Now let's go and look at the actual object array example in our textbook. So I believe that this is on page 448. All right, so here we go. We are going to be prompting the user for balances in the account. So we imported our utility scanner object that we needed there. And this here is all normal. This is our main method header. And right here on line 12, we are using a named constant. We're only going to create 3 bank accounts for this example. And then right here on line 16, which is what we were talking about here today, we are creating our bank account array called accounts equals new bank account, and we're passing our size declarator right there, so that we're only going to be creating 3 accounts. Now again, please remember this statement right here, all it did was create the array of objects which will be bank accounts, but the bank accounts themselves have not yet been created. We have to do that in a loop. So this statement here creates an array of objects, unlike prior to this when we created an array of primitive data types, 2 totally different types of arrays. All right, so here on line 19, we have a method call to create accounts, and we're going to pass accounts to it. Well, accounts is the bank account array that we just created in line 16. Well, for this example, create accounts is a static method, so let's scroll down and see what that does. Okay, so here's our method, private static void create accounts, and we can see that it has a parameter called bank account array. So it's bringing in the bank account, and we just happen to name it array for this method. Now, the first thing we did in this method was create a double variable called balance, so that it will hold the balance that when we prompt the user how much money is this account, we can store it for a moment. All right, so we need a scanner object on line 44, so we created a scanner object so that we can prompt the user. So go to the next page here, zoom in a little bit. All right, and we can see here that we have our for loop now. And this for loop is where we are going to be actually building and creating the accounts that are in the array that we created earlier in this program. So for int index equals 0, we will continue this as long as our index is less than the array length, which we know that we're only creating 3 bank account objects. So on line 50, we prompt the user, enter the balance for account number, and then we say index plus 1 so that it will say account number 1. The user will enter in a value, balance equals keyboard.next double. Now you have to ask yourself here in a real program, if you were writing it, would you have to do a validation loop? Is it possible that the user could have a negative balance in their account? Zero balance, positive balance, okay? If there's a restriction on the type of data that could come in, you would have to validate your loop. But here it is possible that a customer could have a negative balance in their account. So I believe that's why they're not doing a validation loop here. So the customer will enter, or the user will enter in whatever the balance is of the first account. It will get stored in the balance variable that we created for this method. And then we're actually going to create the account. So array, which is the array that we brought in that we're calling array, at index 0, if we're going through the loop for the first time, equals new bank account. Remember, anytime you use a new keyword, that is actually the time that you are constructing your object. So we're creating the new bank account object, and we are passing to that bank account class, the constructor, whatever is stored in balance that the user just now entered for that first account. So we can see down here in the example that for account number 1, the user entered in $2,500. So $2,500 gets passed as an argument here to the bank account class, and that constructor in the bank account class will pull in that $2,500 and go and store it in the balance variable for that first object. Then here's the end of the for loop, but we have to go back up here and do our increment and do our test expression to see if we're finished. This time it will go to index number 1, and we'll go back through, and this will say enter the balance for account number 2. The user will enter in a new balance for account number 2, which we can see down here in the example was $5,000. That now will be stored in balance, and then we will create the second bank account object and pass the $5,000 to that bank account object. And we will continue this loop until all 3 of our bank accounts have been created and the balances have been entered. Then, once this method ends, it bounces back to the next line of code for where it was called. And we can now see here what comes next. So here's where we called the method, right here. So we're finished with that method now. So we bounce back here. And it says display the balances of each account. So just to check to make sure that we did everything correctly, we're now going to display those balances to see if it worked. So here are the balances for each account. And again, we don't want to have a print statement for every account we have, like I discussed with you in the last program. We create a for loop that will loop through the array, the bank account array, and get those balances. So we start with the first one, continue this loop as long as we have accounts in there, and it says account number, and this will be the first account. And then here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to accounts index dot get balance. So we go to the get balance method of the bank account class, and for that first account, it will get the balance and it will display it. And that's it. That's all the more that it's doing. It's a very, very simple program, but it is designed for you so that you can see how to build arrays of objects and how to actually create those objects after you built the array. All right. So what you're going to be doing now is you're going to go into your text. You're going to be doing the checkpoint exercise. I believe that there's just one. And answer that question. That's all we're going to be doing today. So if necessary, make sure you go back and you watch this video a couple of times. Make sure that you read this lesson in your textbook because it's very, very important. It's one of the most powerful things that Java does for you in using objects and arrays. All right, if you have any questions, please make sure you ask.